Hello and welcome to another episode of Litigators Corner. And today I am just very excited to have with me Lillian Alvernaz. And Lillian is one of the heads of the Montana State Bar Indian Law Section and an Indian law attorney. And I know this is an area that a lot of us don't know much about but are very interested in, not only because it is part of our bar history, but because of the current issues involving Indian law and our culture. So Lillian, thank you for coming today. It's so nice to see you.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you as well.
Lillian, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Thanks, Hillary. Rami takiapi, iushkawachiakapi, washichuya, Lillian Alvernaz e makiapi, hoheia, winchakpi wakawianki, Howie. Fort Belknap Indian Community, Ed Dawani, Minnesota Unspe Unkantia Ed Wabadawa Chante Moashteye. Hello, my relatives. My name is Lillian Alvernaz. My Assiniboine name is Sacred Star Woman Who Sits by the Moon. I am Dakota Nakota. I come from the Sistan Wapta Oyate, the Fort Peck Assiniboine, Fort Belknap Assiniboine, and I'm also part Irish. I work for the Fort Belknap Indian Community as the Chief Prosecutor, and I'm studying the Dakota language at the University of Minnesota.
That is fascinating. And were you born on the reservation, or were you born in Montana, or where do you hail from originally?
I was born in Browning, Montana, because my grandmother was a nurse at the Browning IHS, Indian Health Service. However, I have never lived on the Blackfeet Reservation. That's just where I was born. I lived for the first part of my childhood in Western Montana, Whitefish, Montana, and then we moved to Eastern Montana to Glasgow near the Fort Peck Reservation for the remainder of my teen years. And then I moved to Missoula, where I went to college, worked for a couple of years, and then completed law school and worked.
And what inspired you to become an Indian? Do you call it an Indian law attorney, or what? How do you refer to the type of law that you practice?
That's a great question, and I think that's something that I would like to cover, and I can just make that distinction now. So I am both an Indian law practitioner and tribal law practitioner. So there's a difference when you say Indian law or tribal law. So each tribe has its own set of laws, of codes, and that's tribal law. So if I go to court here in Fort Belknap, that's tribal law. However, the distinction with federal Indian law is the relationship between tribes and the federal government, or tribes and states, and that's federal Indian law, which applies to all tribes. And it's important to keep in mind that tribal law applies to each tribe on their own uniquely. But I would call myself both an Indian law practitioner and a tribal law practitioner. Here in Fort Belknap as Chief Prosecutor, I practice mostly tribal law, prosecuting criminal cases representing the Fort Belknap Indian community and bringing justice with the Fort Belknap Tribal Code. However, when I do things like research the special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction provision of the Violence Against Women Act, that's Indian law, and that affects all tribes. And to answer your first part of your question, I became involved in this field with two kind of intersecting experiences. One was racism at a young age. I thought, why do people have such negative perceptions of Indian people, and why don't people understand that, not all natives are drunk or fulfill the stereotypes that I had been called and asked about in a border town, which is a predominantly non-Indian town that borders a reservation, which tends to have higher rates of racism. And then secondly, in my experience as a victim advocate in high school and in college, I encountered walls when trying to bring victims and survivors justice, and because of the jurisdictional issues. So it was both being fueled by an internal fire of wanting to combat racism and as well as bring justice for victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence.
And that is such a noble reason to be involved in the kind of law that you do. And so I was really just so impressed when we interviewed before this about your reasons for wanting to be involved in this kind of law. And is your area, just geographically, what does your geographic area cover, just so our listeners can understand sort of where you're situated and what your general area is?
Thank you. So I'm located in eastern Montana. I work for the Fort Belknap Indian community. I'm the chief prosecutor, which means I enforce the laws of the Fort Belknap Indian community, which only has criminal jurisdiction over the reservation boundaries, the Fort Belknap Reservation.
And is physically, would that be, is there a number of square miles, or could you give us, our viewers, just sort of an idea of how much area that covers?
Off the top of my head, I don't know the square mileage. However, I can tell you that we're one of the largest reservations in Montana.
That is impressive. And it's my understanding that for sovereignty reasons, is it true that there are some crimes that, say, an individual can be charged with twice for differing reasons? For example, if you were tried in a U.S. court, double jeopardy may not attach as for purposes of tribal law. Does that ever come up?
Yes. So there are some cases that we will have charged tribally, and that individual can be tried in federal court for the same crime, yes.
Okay, and could you give us some examples, just so our listeners can learn about what those would be? Because usually, most Anglo-Americans, and that's in the U.S., of course, these people have no familiarity with the tribal system or anything else. Think of the first thing you learn in law school in criminal procedure is the concept of double jeopardy and when that applies. So the idea would be, if you're tried once, if you're found not guilty, you can't be tried again. But that's not always the case, as I understand it, with tribal laws and regulations.
Yes.
So what would some areas be? What would some areas be that, I guess, crimes or causes of action that could be tried twice?
So it's important to keep in mind that tribes are separate sovereigns on the same level as the federal government. So we have our own laws, our own courts, our own land that tribes have sovereign authority over. An example of where someone might think double jeopardy applies is what I see a lot in the area of domestic violence or assault against a family member, where as you may know, or as the listeners may know, your fourth charge, if you have 3 prior charges of convictions of partner, family member assault or dating violence or abuse of a child who you take care of, and your 4th charge is any of those crimes or elder abuse, parent abuse, you can be charged not only in tribal court for that exact crime, but you can stack those charges and be charged federally as a habitual offender for those prior crimes. And while I'm speaking about the habitual offender, I will also just note that the Bill of Rights does not apply to tribes on reservations. So there's no right to counsel at the expense of the government in tribal court. And so that habitual offender provision means that Indian defendants are the only defendants who can be convicted with uncounseled convictions and have that stacked to a felony. So an Indian in tribal court can be convicted 3 times with no counsel, because there's no right to counsel in tribal court at the expense of the government. And that 4th time, it'd be a felony, and a non-Indian off the reservation that has a right to counsel. And I think that's a huge flaw in the restrictions the government puts on tribes.
No, I did not know that. I did not know that they were not afforded the right to counsel. How often would you say it happens where a criminal defendant under tribal law who's accused of a crime is going to not have counsel? Do you think that happens often? What's been your experience? I know you can't really generalize.
Thanks, Hillary. It happens more often than not because currently the tribe does not have a public defender. We do have lay advocates, but of course, just like any other defense attorney, they charge, and individuals don't always have access to the legal representation.
Mm-hmm. And how have you found that the pandemic has affected prosecutions under tribal law? Has that slowed the process? How is that being handled? I'd be curious to know.
So in my short time as chief prosecutor, I've seen when I answer this question about how the pandemic has affected prosecution, it's important to keep in mind that I started during the pandemic. So I don't know what court was like prior to the pandemic. But we've been able to conduct a lot of arraignments and initial appearances and hearings by Zoom, which is very safe and a great alternative to in person. It's saved time and, of course, kept the court safe. But we've continued to move forward because, unfortunately, crime doesn't stop and individuals still need assistance even through the pandemic. I think we've just shifted to more virtual appearances and trying to grant the court and lay advocates a little more leeway because of the disorganization that the pandemic is causing constantly.
And when you're getting an arraignment, I know it's just what do you call the decision maker or the ruler? Are they referred to as a judge, or what is there? Do they have a specific title?
Yes. So we have 2 associate judges and 1 chief judge that we just hired that was just deemed chief judge. And unfortunately, the Fort Belknap Tribal Court looks like a lot like a state or federal court. Mm-hmm. And the Fort Belknap Indian community was what's called an Indian Reorganization Act tribe. So in 1935, the tribe accepted the Indian Reorganization Act, which imposed a boilerplate constitution on the tribal government and established the tribal court here. We are working on indigenizing or bringing in more traditional practices and alternative sentencing, but we're not fully implementing those ideas yet.
Is that because of organization or funding, or not an overall a clear agreement on that, or several factors, I would think?
At this point, it's just because I'm new.
Right. So when a trial proceeds, is there a trial by jury? Is there a bench trial? Is there an option? How does this work? I think a lot of our a U.S. American court system, you sort of know what to expect. You either get a bench or a jury trial, depending on what it is, and you make your decisions. What are the options when you're trying a case in tribal court?
So just like any other court, the defendant has an option of a bench trial or a trial by jury.
And have there been jury trials since the pandemic, or has that been restricted? Or I know crime like you said, crime doesn't stop, and that's the same here in LA and Beverly Hills and in the Bay Area too, where we practice, is that they have to proceed. They have to do something. They can't just wait until they find a vaccine or whenever that may be. So they are proceeding, and I know it's been really difficult. I've talked to a lot of criminal defense attorneys and some prosecutors like you, and I know that it's been really difficult because of the overcrowding. Have there been, I know you can't comment as a general rule, but have you had jury trials since the pandemic has started? Are those proceeding? Are they becoming bench trials, or what's been your experience so far?
So I cannot speak to since the beginning of the pandemic, but in my short time here, which has been 2 months, we have not had a trial yet. But there are we have pre-trials and cases, on the track to have a trial eventually.
Okay. And I know in Los Angeles and in California and in other states, they are making hard decisions about releasing criminals and also deciding not to prosecute certain matters during the pandemic. And I know you can't comment upon the confidentiality of a particular case, but are those factoring into what you think may be sentencing guidelines, or how a case is handled, or how much of a factor is that when you when you assess a case or discuss a case with other counsel or other defendants right now?
It's certainly something that we do discuss and something we do try to take into consideration because it affects everybody, and we're especially a small community. And so if there was an outbreak in a small confined area like the jail, that would definitely devastate our community. So we do address it and we do take it into consideration.
And what is your contact with the community as a prosecutor? I know that, for example, prosecutors and district attorneys and things like that are a really central part of, I think, not just a legal community, but a social or political or economic community, in that they are the leaders of that criminal justice system. And some prosecutors are more involved than not, some because it's appropriate, some because it isn't. Some you only see when they run for election or they're getting reappointed and things like that, or you see a debate. How involved is the prosecutor's office with the local community there?
I think we're extremely involved, and that is because of, one, not everybody has a counsel, as we touched on earlier, but secondly, my colleague has been the tribal prosecutor for 10 years, and so he's established these long-term relationships with a lot of individuals and has lived here almost his entire life. And so the community does trust him, and I think that that's really important, an important aspect of our job. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to physically go out and speak with community members. I am available by phone and people do call me, but unfortunately, just due to the pandemic and the restrictions that we have implemented, I'm not able to physically go out and meet people and, show my face around community events, because a lot of that just isn't happening right now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us are in that same situation where we would go to that luncheon, or we would go to that dinner, we would go to that community center event, or we would go to these events and actually see people, but we just don't know when that's going to happen. There are a lot of aspects of tribal law and I know that it's, when I was admitted to the Montana Bar, I've, certainly taken classwork in addition to what our requirements are. But what are some of the main points that you think that all of our listeners should know about tribal law? Because there are a lot of distinctions and important aspects that I think a lot of people, I don't know this, they don't care, it's just they're not aware of it, it doesn't affect their daily lives, and sometimes they get busy with other things. What would you want them to know about Indian law? Because I know as California, Arizona, a lot of these states have tribal laws and issues that may not be exactly like yours, but are similar.
A couple of things that I would deem as the greatest hits of this area is that tribal law, tribal courts function for the most part very similar to state, local, and federal courts. So yes, we have a prosecutor, sometimes a public defender, we have a judge, a jury, clerks. It's very similar. The other distinction I'd like to raise is just to keep in mind that tribal law is separate from Indian law. And so for tribal law, that's what I would like to highlight, is that we have functioning tribal court systems. And then for Indian law, I will highlight that it's a growing field. It's changing. The Supreme Court has taken another Indian law case out of the Crow Reservation here in Montana, that United States versus Cooley is what it was called in the Ninth Circuit, that we can look forward to oral argument on in the upcoming term. And a lot of Indian law is like regular law, but just a little more complex and a little more nuanced than than other fields of law. So there's like contract law, there's water law, there's family law, all these different areas of the law. And Indian law is all of those subjects, but with an added level of complexity. So we have, of course, like cases involving contracts and jurisdiction, or cases involving water law, but the rights of tribes. And so it's important to keep in mind that it's not a lesser level of the law. It's actually more complex and more demanding than the rest of federal law.
It sounds very rigorous. I'm impressed that you're able to master all that and to assimilate it so efficiently. I had a question. For our listeners, and I've often thought about them myself, I know that we had talked about that. I'm a native Californian, but I do have relatives from that area, and I know that tribal relationships are important, or that eastern part, a little further east than you. But I know that some people don't, as busy as we are, and when we're on the freeway here in LA, or we're traveling to New York, or we're in Colorado, maybe we don't think about the importance of the interrelationships between different cultures and different sects of society, because I sort of view all of the U.S. as a big society, and there are different societies within society. What do you think our listeners need to know about tribal relationship as individuals and as lawyers? What would you want us to know?
As individual people, as well as lawyers, I would give the same advice, which is to really be genuine and establish relationships with people. It's frowned upon for someone to come in and maybe think that they know what's going on and think that they know what's best for the tribe or the tribal court, and instead start with genuine contact and friendships, and build those relationships until eventually you build trust, and people call you for things, or you can call them for things. But that's where I'd start, both as an individual community member as well as an attorney.
So as any other good person would, we reach out to them and genuinely try to meet these people. And we have, I'm sure you have something similar, but we often see this, the roving joke is often you can sort of tell when you go to a social event or another event, the people who are just there to network and hustle your business are the people who are genuinely interested in contributing on several different ways. There's lots of different ways to contribute, and sometimes it's not, you can always usually, if you're fortunate, you can tell the people you can call and say, hey, could I use your advice on this? Or I had a question, could I run this by you? Or hey, maybe even a referral and things like that. Even if it's just on a professional basis, you can usually tell the people who are. I am so appreciate you making the time today. What, do you have any parting thoughts or things that you would want us to know about the Indian tribe, or maybe a few known facts that no one else knows? Maybe not too intimate, obviously, but things that, there are a lot of misconceptions, I think, about Native Americans and tribes and different cultures. I think even different parts of people who live in different parts of the country, and some of it is ignorance and some it is just lack of information. And what would you say to those viewers who want to learn more about Native American tribes and just developing relationships there?
So something that comes to mind that's just important to note, because people I found are often apprehensive, is that as a non-Indian person, you can still practice in tribal court and practice Indian law. Take the necessary classes, speak with your advisor, your Indian law faculty, and if you're coming from a genuine place and you're really interested in the subject matter, you can do tribal law and Indian law, and that's okay. I always like to let people know that, because I get a lot of questions, as a non-Indian, can I do this? Will I be accepted? And yes, you can, because unfortunately we don't yet have enough Indian or Native attorneys to fill all of those positions quite yet. Another thing, as I was speaking, I thought of, if you can refer to a tribe or a person as their specific tribe, how they identify, that's the most important. So like I identify as Dakota, Nakota, right? And so that's how I like to identify. And then after that, Indigenous, Native American, American Indian, etc. So that's also important to keep in mind. I would also advise people just reach out, take the necessary classes. There's a lot of natives on social media that are great to follow, and and entities that combat misconceptions and stereotypes, and at the same time really educate. We just finished that holiday, Thanksgiving. We're going into another holiday. We finished Halloween, and a lot of people, it just like flies right by them, but those are really important markers for natives or tribes, because Halloween, it's not okay to dress up as a Native American or like Pocahontas. That's cultural appropriation. Thanksgiving, same thing. It's people forget that the history or the story we hear is not the truth, and to really do your work and do your own education on what the real story is. And then finally, November was Native American Heritage Month, and so I would really just try to empower people to do a lot of the work on your own and educate yourself rather than burdening my Native friend or whatever, can I ask you a question? There's a lot of stuff that you can do on your own, but don't be afraid. There's information out there, and it's, like I said, a growing field. You'll always have job security. Keep your eye out for the Supreme Court case coming off of the Crow Reservation. We had a couple of cases last term that are fascinating, and I think the rights of tribes are always expanding, and it's really unique and interesting to watch grow.
What is the issue that's being set forth before the U.S. Supreme Court, just so our viewers know, so we can know to look for it? I'm definitely going to look for it. What is the issue there?
So the issue is a Native law enforcement, right? So law enforcement for the tribe stopped an individual on a public highway on the reservation, but did not ascertain whether that individual they stopped was Indian or non-Indian. The Ninth Circuit said that the law enforcement officer did not have the right to apprehend or question this person or enforce the law on the reservation. Because he did not determine whether or not the person he stopped was Indian or non-Indian, which to me is problematic. Why would you not want to give law enforcement officers more authority to protect our people on the reservations rather than take it away? Because that just drives the stereotype of you can go to the res and commit a crime and you won't be held accountable. So the fact that the Supreme Court did take that case up, I'm hoping means that they'll reverse the lower court's decision. But there's been wilder outcomes.
There has. I'm just reminded of the classic in maybe off the reservation would be that several cars go by and some are speeding, some are not, and there's an African American couple in a car and they get pulled over and no one else does, and they're abiding all the laws. So yeah, I sort of reminds me of that selective enforcement issue there that they have. So that will be really interesting to see, and I will think good thoughts with Lillian. This has been so informative and interesting, and I am so encouraged and just really inspired by not only the work you're doing, but your commitment to what you're doing. And I really appreciate you making the time today to speak with us. And thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, for thinking about me, and for highlighting this very important topic of Indian law and tribal law. Thank you. Take care.